Nuna and Jin Hyuk cheerfully greet Jamin, saying he arrived quite early today. In response, Jamin greets the guys with great joy and smiles at them. Nuna asks the guy if he's seen the group chat. Jamin replies that he's watching a video and decides to ask if the guys are hinting at a party to celebrate the start of the semester. Nuna confirms this and asks if Jamin will go, but the guy with glasses just says, "What kind of weird questions are these?" Then Nuna and Jamin shout in unison that there will be delicious meat and great alcohol at the party, so he simply can't miss it. Suddenly, a guy with red hair walks into the classroom. He slams the door behind him, catching Jamin's attention. Jamin recognizes him as Ha Minwoo. Nuna asks if it's really him, since it's pretty strange that Minwoo is also attending these lectures. As soon as Minwoo approaches his desk, Ha-min Nuna comes up to him. Taken by surprise, the red-haired guy flinches. Meanwhile, Nuna remains completely unfazed, smiling as he rests his head on his hands. Minwoo asks, "Did you really sign up for these lectures too, Nuna?" She confirms this and says that Jamin and Jin Hyuk are here as well. Minwoo is surprised by this. But before he has a chance to recover from his surprise, Nuna asks him if he's coming to the party tonight. Minwoo gave her a puppy dog look and said that his notifications had been turned off, so he knew absolutely nothing about tonight's party. He wondered whether he should go or not, and he was also curious if Nakyoung would be attending the party. Minwoo got up from his chair and, leaning his hands on the desk, said he should ask Nakyoung a few things first and then make a decision. Nuna agreed, all the while continuing to give him a cheerful look. When Nuna started walking back to her group, the first thing Jamin asked her was what Minwoo had said about the party, but he wanted to ask Nakyeon first. This surprised the girl and made her wonder if they were dating by any chance, since Minwoo usually always asks Nakyeon to go with him. The brunette confirmed this, saying that in his opinion, the two were very close. Then Jamin watched his friends thoughtfully. Nakyeon shouted at the top of her lungs that she didn't want to go to events like that. Hearing this, Manwha decided to try to persuade her anyway. He tried to pique her interest. He told her there would be plenty of meat dishes at the party and pointed out that, on top of everything else, Nakyeon herself knows perfectly well how much he loves places like that. Then the girl said she'd already told him she had the day off today and would therefore prefer to relax at home. Nakyeon asked her boyfriend if he had perhaps already forgotten how, just recently, he'd gotten so drunk that he turned into a dog. At these words, Manwha felt uneasy because he remembered perfectly well how he'd pretended to be a dog and barked at everyone. Then, wanting to persuade the girl to go with him, the guy said that this time he would hardly drink at all. Nakyeon pressed her hand to her forehead and asked, "What about that day?" Minwoo said everything was fine, and that day would be tomorrow. These words made the girl pause to think for a moment. Finally, she made up her mind. Nakyeon agreed and said they could go to the party together. Hearing this, Minwoo beamed with joy. He smiled broadly and said, "I love you, Kim Nakyeon. See you there." Some time passed, and Minwoo was riding public transportation. It was so noisy inside that it only made him feel negative. He also thought about how he'd only taken 1 or 2 doses of pills. So why did he feel so strange? These feelings made him frown and worry. They were exactly the same as they had been that other time. Glancing at the calendar, the red-haired guy wondered why everything was like this, since even the date seemed fine. Very soon after, Nakyeon was sitting at the same table with Minwoo. She noticed that he wasn't himself and asked if he was okay. At that moment, he pressed his hand to his face and said he just wasn't feeling very well. Nakyeon asked him how this could have happened, since she'd told him not to drink. Then he started crying and said he'd barely had anything to drink, and Nakyeon had even seen that herself. Nearby, the group spots 2 friends. The first one asks the second if she'd been smoking, and the second replies, "Of course I did," adding that the moon is just amazing tonight. It's so big and bright. Minwoo and Nakyeon were simply amazed by the news that they'd be able to see a huge full moon tonight. Then the group froze in place and fell silent for a moment. After that, Minwoo and his girlfriend began to walk away. They told the others that they were leaving first and asked the rest to have a great time, but no one could figure out why they were leaving the party so suddenly. Before they left, Nakyeon told the group that her older sister had sent Minwoo a message asking him to come over immediately because she needed help. Nakyeon apologized for this, but a sense of sadness hung over their friends as the 2 of them left. Jamin noticed that Minwoo and Nakyeon were leaving. He then gathered his thoughts and told everyone that he was going to leave too, first to smoke a little, and then he'd come back. However, when he took out his pack of cigarettes and realized it was completely empty, he added that he needed to stop by the 24-hour store, and then they let him go. Jamin stepped outside, looked around, and then raised his gaze to the sky. He noticed a beautiful, large, and very bright full moon. Right after admiring the beautiful moon, the guy looked around in front of and behind him, searching for a place where he could smoke. Suddenly, the guy heard someone not far away say, "Hey, you said the date was fine." In response, another voice replied, "Sorry, I must have forgotten to change the date." Jamin continued to listen to the conversation. He heard the female voice say that her companion was lucky, that she was always there for him, and that without her, he'd be lost, while the male voice replied that he could always count on Nakyeon. Hearing these voices and the dialogue, Jamin assumes they belong to Kim Nakyeon and Ha Minwoo. The girl said that Minwoo would have to be grateful to her for the rest of his life, and in any case, she asked the guy to hurry so that no one would notice them here looking like this. Hearing footsteps, Jamin looks back toward the source of the sound, but what he saw truly frightened him. He flinched and even accidentally dropped his cigarette from his hands. He saw Nakyeon standing before him, holding a huge animal on a leash that resembled a large wolf. The only thing that distinguished it from a wolf was the bright red and snow-white hues of its fur. Jamin was so shocked by this sudden encounter that he was simply speechless, and for a moment felt as if he'd stepped out of reality. The girl was also very shocked and couldn't say a word. A moment later, a loud scream echoed throughout the entire neighborhood. Jamin and Nakyeon screamed very loudly when they saw each other. Jamin was incredibly surprised. After a couple of seconds, he finally began to make sounds, trying to form words with them. The girl and the dog were just as surprised. They opened their mouths and kept screaming, though more quietly now. Jamin didn't even blink. He carefully examined the creature standing next to Nakyeon and asked her if there was a wolf beside her. Then Nakyeon smiled awkwardly and said that it wasn't a wolf at all, but it looked very much like one because of its enormous size. The guy then breathed a sigh of relief and said that he felt better knowing it was a dog. Jamin remarked that the dog was very beautiful and asked the girl if he could pet it, which greatly surprised the wolf, as he hadn't expected such a reaction from the boy. The girl looked away and said that Jamin could pet her dog since he really loved being petted, only that turned out to be a lie, and the wolf was very angry with her. Then Jamin crouched down in front of Nakyeon and looked into the dog's face. As he thought about the dog, he asked, "Hi, can I pet you?" But the dog didn't react at all. His muzzle was as still as stone. He drank the contents of the vial and closed his eyes, waiting for the effect. A few moments later, the boy felt a strong dizziness. The poison was taking effect. However, instead of losing consciousness, he suddenly felt his strength returning. The experiment had succeeded. The girl smiled broadly. She put her hand to her lips and said, "Wow, someone really likes being petted." The dog was very angry at the girl's reaction. He blushed with embarrassment and muttered to himself that he'd show her her place later. The dog wasn't going to put up with being treated that way. He turned around and began walking away from Nakyeon and Jamina at a steady pace, while they stared after him in confusion. Then the girl waved to the guy and apologized to him, saying it was time for them to leave. Jamin went along with her and said goodbye to her. As he watched the girl and the dog quickly walk away from him, the guy thought that the whole thing was somehow rather strange. Once Nakyeon and the dog had moved away, Jamin remarked that he thought he'd heard Ha Minwoo's voice, so he looked back at the girl and the dog to figure out where the sound had come from. A short while later, Ha Minwoo's sister creaked open the bedroom door and asked Minwoo where he'd been all this time while he was away from home. Nakyeon wanted to start making excuses to Nuna, but the girl stood her ground. She reminded Nakyeon that it was a full moon tonight, and therefore it was dangerous for Minwoo to be wandering the streets right now. After saying this, Nuna turned to the dog and asked if he had anything to say in his defense. But he just lowered his muzzle, and an atmosphere of gloom settled around him. Then Nakyeon intervened in the conversation again. She tried to justify herself by saying that it had all happened by accident and they'd simply made a mistake. Besides, nothing terrible had happened. They'd just patted Minwoo. Then a shout rang out in the room. Nuna asked loudly, "Did someone actually see him?" At that moment, Nakena stumbled over her words, sometimes confirming the information, sometimes denying it. But when she finally confirmed it for good, she said she'd imagined Minwoo as her dog, so there shouldn't be any problems. Minwoo himself was very upset and paid no attention to the little dog, who wanted to play with him. Nuna shouted even louder, "What if he hadn't believed you? Minwoo, do you even realize how much trouble you could have gotten yourself into?" With that, Minwoo stormed out of the room and slammed the door behind him. Nuna was very upset that Minwoo had simply run off, while Nakyeon smiled awkwardly. Soon, Nakyeon waved her hand and said, "I think it's time for me to go." By then, Nuna had already calmed down. She smiled and thanked the girl for bringing Minwoo, then said goodbye to her. After Nakena left and slammed the door behind her, Nuna stood there for a long time, gazing thoughtfully at the spot where the girl had just been. Meanwhile, Manwha had already lain down on the cot and was about to fall asleep to rest after all that had happened today. The dog had almost closed his eyes but soon opened them again. He recalled the events of the day, especially the moment when Jaemin said he thought he'd heard Manwha. Jaemin had wanted to say that the dog reminded him of someone, which had made the dog very nervous. But soon the guy realizes everything and laughs at his own thoughts. He says it's complete nonsense and couldn't happen in real life, unless it were in a movie. Then, Nakyeon smiles and says, "Yeah, something like that couldn't happen in real life," she added. Then she, Manwha, and Jaemin parted ways. Just then, Manwha's sister arrived to pick him up, so he quickly got in the car and drove off. Then the guy with glasses said that now everything made sense to him. And with that, they said goodbye. Manwha is very worried. He's not sure if Nakyeon was actually able to change Jaemin's mind. Soon the dog jumped up and cried out, "What if he really did figure it all out? How could I have let that happen?" The dog lay down on the bed and started tossing and turning from side to side. Manwha now didn't know what to do about all this. No matter how you looked at it, the dog really liked being petted. Just as Manwha was yelling so loudly, someone from the other room asked him not to yell so loudly in the middle of the night. Manwha began to calm himself down, telling himself that everything would be okay and that he shouldn't panic. The boy pictures Gemini in his mind, looking at him with loving eyes and telling him that Manwha is a good dog. At the thought of this, the dog relaxes and smiles contentedly. But very soon, Manwha felt his heart start pounding wildly. He began yelling throughout the house that something was pounding very hard inside him. The dog thinks he's simply gone crazy and yells about it very loudly, while Manwha's sister yells at him very angrily through the door. "I'm going to skin you alive if you don't calm down." Manwha transformed back into his human form. He thought to himself that he really did need to calm down, but he still couldn't figure out why his heart was pounding so hard. At the same time, Jimin returned home. He took a shower and immediately sat down at his laptop. Suddenly, the guy looked into his bag and noticed a red dog keychain that Nakena had dropped. The moment Jimin noticed it, he quickly caught up to Nakena and shouted to her from the corner of the building that she'd dropped the dog keychain, but the girl either didn't hear him or was in such a hurry that she didn't react at all. That day, a crowd gathered in the square to witness the sentencing. The condemned man stood with his head bowed, without uttering a word. The sentence was carried out quickly. The crowd fell silent. Among the onlookers stood a little boy who couldn't take his eyes off what was happening. That day remained etched in his memory forever. As the young man rode public transportation, he continued to think about that dream. He was deeply troubled by the fact that he had started having such dreams. Manwha thought that he must have had that dream because of what happened yesterday, but he still couldn't understand how his imagination could have gone that far. But the guy did like the image of Jamin. Catching himself thinking this, Manwha jumped up and started waving his arms, telling himself he wasn't normal at all, and begging himself to stop thinking about such things. He felt someone tug at his sleeve and call his name. He started shifting from side to side, apologizing to the others for disturbing them. However, the one who had called him turned out to be Nakyeon. She looked him over carefully and asked him why he was acting so strangely and what he was thinking about. Why he was so lost in his own thoughts. The young man apologized again, this time to the girl, and then asked her if she knew Park Jamin. Nakyeon replied that she knew him, and perhaps even a little better than Manwha himself. However, she didn't have much to say about him. The girl advises Manwha to talk to Hyman Nuna about Jamin, since they get along well. Manwha then says he doesn't think that's a good idea. When Manwha and Nakyeon get off the subway, the girl says she now understands perfectly where the guy's mind is. He doesn't quite understand what Nakyeon means, so he decides to ask her again. Then the girl asks, "Park Jamin, did you like him?" This sudden question even startled Manwha. He blushed deeply and shouted that it was simply impossible, so Nakyeon says she knows Manwha even better than he knows himself and suggests he follow his Nuna's example. But Manwha didn't understand what his older sister had to do with any of this and decided to ask about it. Then Nakyeon told him to just go have lunch with Jamin. Nakyeon began to explain that her older sister had always been brave ever since elementary school. She was just as brave in middle school too. And in high school, she always stood out among her classmates for her extraordinary courage. Nakyeon looks up at the guy and tells him to be as brave as Nuna. Manwha then covers his face with his hands, deeply embarrassed, and starts to object, saying that Park Jamin is, after all, a guy. But that doesn't stop Nakyeon. She asks the guy to ignore that detail and go show his true character. Manwha thinks to himself that he simply can't help but agree. After all, Nakyeon has a point. But on the other hand, he's extremely embarrassed. At that moment, the girl cuts short all his hesitation, forcing him to make a decision quickly. Yesterday, Manwha felt like a bit of a fool, and it was all because of Jaemin, even though he doesn't really want to admit it. Because of all this, Manwha feels as if he's reached a dead end. Nakyun, still just as enthusiastic, asks the guy if he likes Park Jaemin. But Manwha feels awkward about what she's saying, so he asks Nakyun not to be so direct. Nakyun then gives him some advice. If he decides to talk to Jaemin, he shouldn't bring up what happened yesterday in their conversation. Nakyun said that Jaemin doesn't know he saw Manwha instead of a dog, but if the guy wants to bring it up, he should be careful. Manwha fell deep in thought. He'd actually already put that out of his mind by now. Nakyun says something like, "Manwha, you should invite Jaemin to have lunch together," to which the guy replies, "That would be a bit too soon." So Nakyun asks, "Why not? We could just have some coffee together and talk. It'd be a good way to get to know each other better." Manwha wonders if he might be messing things up, but then he catches himself thinking that he doesn't even want to think about his possible failures. Nakyun interrupted his thoughts. She asked him to wait for her a moment while she went to throw away her cup. Manwha closes his eyes and smiles. He's happy that he and Jaemin haven't crossed paths at all today. The thing is, because of today's dream, he feels a little awkward around Jaemin. Thinking about how terrified Manwha was to come face to face with Jaemin, the guy creaked open the door. Only when he opened his eyes did he see someone he never expected to see here right now. Jaemin was standing right on the threshold. This encounter was a huge surprise for both of them. Seeing Jaemin in front of him, Manwha began to panic as he was too afraid to even look the guy in the eye, all because of his dream. Jaemin was very surprised. He asked, "Wait, does Manwha take this class too?" Manwha replied, "Yes," saying he also attended that class. Soon, Nakyun approached the group. She greeted Jaemin, and just as Manwha was about to leave in a hurry out of awkwardness, she stopped him. The guys had come to a rather boring lecture. They sat there reluctantly, occasionally jotting down important points in their notebooks. Manwha wondered, at what point did my classes and Jaemin's start overlapping? He recalls how noisy everyone was when they were choosing their courses. He thinks that must have been when he missed that moment. At that moment, Manwha bit down so hard on his palm that he screamed out loud across the entire lecture hall because his palm started to hurt so badly. The professor then asked him to be quieter, and he awkwardly apologized to all the students. The guy blushed deeply, feeling very ashamed of his behavior, while Jaemin put his hand to his face and smiled. Soon, a brilliant idea came to the brunette. He took out a piece of paper and a pen and began to write something. Then he showed the piece of paper to Manwha. Looking at it, the guy realized that Jaemin wanted to invite him to have lunch together after class. Manwha was very surprised that Jaemin was taking the initiative in their conversation, and he asked, "Me? Why?" Jaemin doesn't answer the question at all. He just smiles sweetly, waiting for Manwha's response. Manwha shivers. He doesn't understand what Jaemin's sweet smile means. However, he doesn't like it, since it's rather suspicious and strange, and so the guy doesn't know what to expect. The class ended fairly quickly. The teacher said the words everyone had been waiting for. "Thank you, everyone. You're free to go." The students immediately began gathering their things so they could leave as quickly as possible. Kim stretched, loosening up her back after sitting at the desk for so long. She exhaled. So much new information in just the first lecture. Manwha agreed with her and said he'd started to think he might die here. Park Jaemin turned to Manwha and asked if he could wait for him a little while. The guy suddenly remembered something. He began apologizing, explaining that he'd promised to have lunch with Nakyun. Meanwhile, the girl was watching him. When Jaemin heard this, he said that since that was the case, they could catch up next time. To which Manwha replied that they definitely would. Nayeon listened to all of this, but it was completely unclear what was going on in her head. Suddenly, she let out a loud gasp, and the guys turned their attention to her. She had completely forgotten that she was supposed to meet Nayeon right then. She said she was leaving Jaemin with Manwha. The dark-haired guy was delighted and thanked her for freeing him up. Manwha grabbed Nayeon by her clothes and started shaking her. Was she really going to ask him at a moment like this? The guy wondered. His face showed complete bewilderment. The girl pulled him closer and said that was exactly what she meant. But she'd treat him next time. For now, she'd leave them alone. She gave him a thumbs up and told Manwha not to let her down. Then she said goodbye to them and left. Manwha looked utterly desperate and realized he was in deep trouble. The advisor raised his goblet and took a sip, completely unaware of anything. Soon he began to feel unwell and was forced to leave the hall. The protagonist watched him leave, realizing that the plan had worked. The next day, it became known that the advisor had fallen seriously ill. The protagonist made a note in his journal and continued his work. Manwha clutched the bottle that Jaemin had given him. Manwha asked the young man why he hadn't wanted to go to the cafe, since it wasn't such a bad place. Jamin didn't immediately understand what Manwha was talking about and didn't know how to respond. After thinking for a moment, he replied that they didn't need prying ears. Manwha's expression immediately darkened, but he replied that he understood everything. Yet thoughts were swirling in his head that this was all so serious. And then Jamin began to speak, addressing Manwha. At that moment, the guy's heart started racing like crazy. When Jamin finished his sentence, Manwha was at a loss. The guy asked him what his personality type was, ENFP or something else. Manwha was still puzzled and asked why he was even asking that question, to which Jamin replied that he was just curious. Once he'd regained his composure, Manwha answered the guy, saying he didn't know what his personality type was. But in his head, he was wondering what on earth this guy was asking about and why they couldn't discuss it in a cafe. After getting that answer, Jamin didn't stop. He asked what Manwha's blood type was, A or not. Manwha's was indeed A. The next question was about his zodiac sign. Jamin asked if he was a Gemini, but Manwha turned out to be a Virgo. He was born on September 11th. Then Jamin stopped him and asked if his ruling planet was also Mercury, to which Manwha replied that he didn't really know much about that. Jamin had one last question for Manwha. The guy was very happy about this and said that of course he could ask him questions. He was happy to answer. There was an instant silence, and Jamin asked the guy if it was true that he was a werewolf. Manwha hadn't expected such a turn of events and immediately spat out all the soda he had in his mouth onto the ground. The guy stared straight ahead as the remains of the soda dripped onto the ground. Meanwhile, Jamin watched the guy's reaction closely. Manwha began wiping the soda off his face and pretended he had no idea what they were talking about or what kind of werewolf they were referring to. He asked if it was a joke or something. Maybe Jamin was referring to some TV show or something like that. By this point, Jamin had finished his cigarette and was stubbing out the butt in the trash can. The guy reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He held his hand out to Manwha and told him to take it. Manwha was frozen in shock and didn't know what to do. As he reached out, the keychain he'd previously been carrying on his backpack fell into his palm. He examined the keychain and made sure it was indeed his. He was overjoyed to see his little one again and began thanking Jamin for returning it to him. The guards led the detainee into the interrogation room. The protagonist addressed him in a calm tone, making it clear that a conversation was inevitable. At first, the detainee refused to speak, but he soon realized he had no choice. Manwha thought to himself what a fool he was and began to tremble, clutching a can of soda in his hands. He acted as if he hadn't heard what Jamin had said and asked him to repeat it. The more he thought about yesterday, the more oddities he noticed. He said he'd believe them, but now, if Manwha wanted this to remain a secret, he'd have to play along with Jamin. Manwha looked up at him and couldn't believe what he was hearing. Manwha just couldn't believe what the guy was saying and kept asking what he meant by that. He asked again, "Do I really have to play this game?" In response, Jamin said, "There's no one else here but you." The guy clutched his head. He realized that this was indeed the case and began to slowly understand where all this was leading. He blushed deeply at the suddenness of the proposal. He couldn't understand why Jamin was suggesting such a thing. Manwha blushed deeply. To be honest, he'd been thinking about treating Jamin to something or giving him some money, but he hadn't expected anything like this at all. The guy covered his face with his hand. He was blushing intensely from the overwhelming embarrassment that was paralyzing his entire body. Now Manwha didn't know how he should react, since he'd never been in a situation like this before. The guy got to his feet. He realized that, one way or another, this was a threat from Jamin. So he turned to the guy and asked, "If we play together, will anyone find out about it?" Then the guy moves closer to Jamin. He blushes deeply but says in a loud voice, "Okay, I'll do it." Jamin was very surprised, as he hadn't expected Manwha to agree so quickly. Manwha, for his part, fell silent and waited for a response from the guy across from him. Then Jamin smiled, and then he started laughing out loud. But Manwha couldn't understand why he was laughing, so he watched the guy's reaction irritably, puzzled. Jamin was laughing so hard that tears streamed down his face. He wiped them away with his fingers and apologized to Manwha. The guy turned his head away and said, "Of course I was joking." He added that he hadn't even thought Manwha would take it all seriously. At that, Manwha blushed even more and shouted. Manwha asked again, "Is that a joke?" And, upon receiving an affirmative answer, asked his friend to stop making fun of him. In response, Jamin said he was genuinely sorry for wanting to tease the guy, especially since he was taking it so seriously. Manwha closed his eyes and smiled, thinking that, by the looks of it, he'd really messed up after all. Now he was feeling rather mixed emotions. Jamin watched Manwha's smile. He thought about something for a moment, then approached Manwha. The guy wanted to grab Manwha by the fabric of his clothes, and almost did, but since he was hesitant and didn't want to do it where others could see, he pulled his hands away from Manwha. Then Jaemin turned his body and looked at the guy. He waved at him and told Manwha not to worry because he wouldn't tell anyone about them. Manwha, thoughtfully, and even with a certain sense of excitement, agreed with the guy's words. Then Jaemin wondered, could Manwha really have thought that I was capable of doing and suggesting something like that? Feeling a new wave of shame, Manwha began to deny those words. Night fell. As planned, Jaemin went to meet his friends at the bar. As soon as he entered the building, he began looking around. He immediately spotted Kyuho-gek, who looked up and, seeing Jaemin, said, "Oh, you're here." Jaemin walked over to a chair and sat down in his spot. He muttered, "Han decided not to wait and to eat without me." In response, Kyuho said, "You yourself said that I could start eating without you." Only then did Jaemin take it in stride and even suggest that they order another round. The guy also added that he'd been planning to ask for seconds anyway, so he called over the waiter and asked if they could have some more. The waiter replied with a brief, "Sure." Jaemin turned to Kyuho and remarked that he usually doesn't find time for get-togethers like this. Kyuho said that today he'd just gotten lucky with his side job, roughly speaking. Then Jaemin asks, "So you decided to take a walk and have some fun right across from the university?" Kyuho asks the guy to pour him a drink and says that everything is exactly as Jaemin describes it. The guys were served some very fragrant and juicy pieces of meat. Just as Kyuho reached for the food, he noticed that Jaemin wasn't showing any interest in the appetizer, so he asked, "Aren't you going to have any? Did you lose your appetite?" The guy with glasses replied that he was just lost in thought for a moment and then let Kyuho eat. Soon, Jaemin adjusted his glasses. He turned to his friend and asked, "What if you made someone play as a form of punishment?" At first, Kyuho didn't understand what he was talking about. He asked for clarification, but they still had no idea what game Jaemin was referring to. A long conversation ensued between the two guys. Jaemin told him about Manwha, explaining that Manwha had wanted to use it as a punishment but ultimately said it was all just a joke. Kyuho decided to ask the guy if he was okay with the fact that nothing would happen between him and Manwha. Kyuho also didn't quite understand why someone would threaten to make him play a game if, in the end, it wasn't going to happen. Jaemin wondered if Manwha might already have a girlfriend, and that he'd simply forgotten to ask about it yet. Kyuho was surprised that Jaemin could have forgotten to ask something like that in the first place. Soon, Kyuho offers his advice. He suggests that Jaemin simply be kinder to Manwha, since Manwha would really appreciate it one way or another. All this time, Jaemin had been listening very carefully to his words. Jaemin asks if Kyuho himself would like that. Kyuho asks the guy not to shift the blame onto him, so Jaemin has no choice but to agree. Soon, Jaemin admits that he's actually somewhat interested in the idea. After all, when you think about it, Manwha is pretty handsome, which means it would be fun to play video games with him. Kyuho asks the guy what he's decided to do after all, and the guy replies that one way or another, they're just too different. Besides, Jaemin said he's not interested in dating at all right now. Kyuho started laughing and said, "And anyway, being a college couple." But Jaemin didn't like that the guy was laughing so loudly, so he asked him why he was laughing and said he was completely serious. In response, he heard only the phrase, "Yeah, like I'd believe you." Some time passed, and Jaemin was already heading home late at night. He was very puzzled. He reassured himself with the thought that he wouldn't fall in love with Manwha. 3 years ago, during the freshman initiation ceremony. Back then, everyone was having fun and participating in the various contests at the event. Hemin looked around. She was curious to see who would be performing next. Soon her gaze settled on Jaemin. She thought to herself that he was really impressive. She was also curious how long it had taken him to come up with all of this. The guy said, "Yeah, actually it wasn't that easy," and then turned to the girl and asked, "Who's next?" Before she could even say the name of the person coming out, they both started watching him walk onto the stage. Jaemin and Hemin gasped when they recognized who had come out. Hemin exclaimed happily, "Wow, I can't believe it! This is a costume contest!" A red-haired guy with eyes as yellow as the sun, dressed in a maid's uniform, appeared before the group. When the guy on stage was asked to introduce himself, he smiled broadly, stepped up to the microphone and said, "Hi everyone, I'm Manwha, the cutie from Group XX." People immediately started showering him with compliments. First, they mentioned that he had a very beautiful and rare name. He thanked them for being so polite and kind to him. They also told him that everything else about him was even better, and Manwha thanked them for that too, saying he'd put a lot of effort into his costume. The guy raises his hand and says he borrowed the costume from his sister while she was out, and if she finds out about it, no one will ever see him alive again, which triggers a wave of laughter and applause. The audience asks the guy to show them something so they'll definitely remember him, and he shouts to the whole hall that he'll perform a dance by the idol group XXX. Immediately after saying this, the guy starts moving to the beat of the song, imitating the idol group's graceful and very beautiful dance. Watching this scene, Haemin is simply in awe of the dancer. After all, he's doing quite well. When the girl turned around and looked at Jamin, she saw how admiringly he was watching the guy's dance. Haemin says that Jamin must have fallen in love with him, since he's looking at the dance with such loving eyes. Then the guy said, "Oh, look who's talking." Then Jamin started thinking about how the guy really was quite handsome. He racked his brain and remembered that the red-haired guy's name was Minwoo. A little while later, Jamin walked over to Minwoo and asked him why he was sitting alone when there were so many people around, each with their own unique group of friends. Smiling and trying to be as friendly as possible, Jamin asked, "Park Jamin, right?" Minwoo turned to the guy and said that he had performed very well today, and that he hadn't even managed to perform that well himself, so he was actually a little jealous of him. Jamin thanked him for the kind words and also said that Minwoo's performance had been really cool too. Minwoo asks the guy, "Really? I tried to be really cute." To which Jamin replies that the guy did a great job with it all. Soon, Jamin turns to the red-haired guy and says that he still has a little bit of women's lipstick left. Minwoo is confused. He doesn't understand where the lipstick is. Then Jamin touches the guy's lips with his finger and wipes off the lipstick that's no longer needed. Minwoo is very surprised by this. Suddenly, Jamin jumps back. Sensing that he might be making Minwoo feel uncomfortable, he apologizes, while Minwoo says it's okay and thanks the guy for wiping the excess lipstick off his face. Then one of the guys asks Minwoo why he's holed up in the corner. He invites Minwoo to go have a drink with him, and Minwoo agrees. Minwoo tells Jamin that they'll see each other again, while the brunette agrees and thinks to himself how cute Minwoo is. Jamin is lying in his room. Besides these memories, he also recalls that the next day he met Kyu Ho Hen. The guy blushed deeply at the thought he'd just had about Minwoo. Jamin imagined that Minwoo's eyes were like those of a real predator, though very soon he was surprised by his own fantasy. Classes began at the university. There was a somewhat gloomy atmosphere in the air. The girls observed Minwoo's and Jamin's behavior, and concluded that they might have had a falling out, which was why they were acting so strangely. Haemin approached Nakyeon and asked her what had happened with the guys and why they were acting so strangely, but even Nakyeon didn't know anything. She explained that Minwoo had been like that since early that morning, but he hadn't explained to her the reason for his bad mood. Then Haemin exclaimed that she simply hated this kind of thing. She added that she would take care of Park Jamin, and Minwoo should let Nakyeon take care of him. The girl agreed to these terms. Haemin decided not to waste any time. She immediately ran up to Jamin and asked him what had happened between him and Minwoo. She also said that because of their gloomy expressions and behavior, she and Nakyeon felt as if they were sitting under a cloud. These words made Jamin think. It was true that there was a strange atmosphere between them right now, but he soon came up with an excuse, saying that nothing had happened and that he was just tired. Then Haemin asked again, "Really?" wanting to know how sincere Jamin was with her. She asks him if maybe something else had happened. Then she asks him to tell her who had upset him. But he just smiles and says nothing like that had happened. In reality, nothing really did happen. Jamin had simply been thrown off guard by remembering Minwoo and the wolf's face at a moment that wasn't exactly ideal for that. Jamin wonders if maybe he should take things further with that guy. Although at the same time, he understood perfectly well that jokes like that are simply rude. But when Jamin looks back and sees Manwha with a girl, he still can't figure out why Manwha looks so sad. Then the guy turns away, props his head up with his hand, and smiling, tells himself to just let it go. But Manwha was actually very sad and pensive. But his thoughts were soon interrupted when the girl pulled him into a very tight embrace. Nakyeon asks the guy, "So, what happened between you and Jamin?" The guy looks at her, puzzled, and asks, "How did you find out?" Jamin soon screamed, "Minwoo! Did you really confess?" The girl threw herself at the guy with an even tighter embrace. In a fit of hysteria, she asked, "How could you hide this from me? Did he reject you? Come here. I'm always ready to comfort you." Minwoo said, "No, that's not it at all," and looked at the girl's face, waiting for her reaction. Soon, Minwoo began to wonder what Jamin had actually done. After all, he hadn't rejected him at all. He'd just been joking with him. As he thought about this, hope began to grow in Minwoo's heart. He realized that he still had a chance to be with Jamin after all. Realizing this, the boy smiled broadly, and his eyes sparkled with hope. The guy asks Nakyeon if he has a chance. The girl says she doesn't know what he's talking about, but Minwoo does have a chance after all. Sometime later, a group of people are drinking. They slam their beer mugs down on the table, saying, "Why is it so hard to talk about this?" Manwha thinks that even though their classes overlap, Jaemin either doesn't show up or, if he does, disappears right away. On one of those days, he asked where Jaemin was, and they told him he was probably asleep. But when he texted Jaemin to ask if he had any free time, Jaemin apologized and said he didn't. All of this makes Manwha feel a bit panicked, because this is basically always how it goes. It seems to him that Jaemin is simply avoiding him, which makes him feel very sad, since he doesn't even understand why he's being avoided. The guy was really down at that moment. He rested his head on the desk, and then his classmates asked who Manwha was talking about. They assumed he was talking about a girlfriend. Then the blonde girl looked around and asked where Nakyeon had gone. A saddened Manwha said in a quiet voice that Nakyeon was currently at her grandmother's birthday party. The girls then suggest that the guy surprised Nakyeon by coming to her grandmother's birthday party too, but he says he isn't talking about her at all and isn't thinking about her. The blonde girl then suggests he call her directly and invite her out somewhere, to which the guy thinks, yeah, I could, or maybe not. In the end, the guy agrees but decides to have a drink first. With a bottoms-up toast, he downs an entire mug of beer. Some time passed. The guy's friends approached him. One of them said, "Ha, Manwha, who fed you so much?" At that moment, the girl standing nearby replied, "You just fed him yourself." To which the guy responded, "I won't let him drink that much again." The guy is really glad that Manwha at least passed out by the end. Otherwise, it would have been the same as always when the guy starts sorting out his relationships while drunk. Soon, the brown-haired guy asks for Manwha's address, since he won't be able to stand there holding Manwha for much longer. Then the blonde spots Jaemin in the distance, standing there and looking around. At that moment, Manwha's ears perked up like a dog's. He caught Jaemin's scent, jumped up abruptly, and started running toward him, greatly surprising everyone present who couldn't figure out what had happened to the guy's hair. But most of them decided they must have just imagined it. Literally a moment later, Manwha runs up to Jaemin and abruptly grabs his hand, all the while keeping the wolf ears on his head. Their eyes met. They were both extremely embarrassed, and Manwha blushed deeply. They were also both surprised, as they hadn't expected to run into each other like this. After a few seconds of silence, Manwha said, "Park Jaemin." He wanted to say something else, but couldn't. He felt very strange, as if something were preventing him from saying the words that were so important to him. In the end, Manwha simply patted Jaemin on the shoulder. Jaemin looked back. He noticed Manwu's hair, as well as the fact that the guy's wolf ears had popped out. This seemed very strange to him, especially considering that they looked like real ears that had appeared literally out of nowhere. Later, Jaemin sat at the bar, recalling how Nakyeon had hugged Manwha tightly earlier and comforted him. Suddenly, the guy heard someone call out to him, asking why he was sitting there alone and looking so sad. It was a dark-eyed guy with red hair. Jaemin replied, "Nothing," answering the question about why he was so sad, and then asked the guy in return if he had come here alone. Some time passed. The thing is, Jaemin was looking for someone who looked like Manwha, and this red-haired guy was perfect for the part. They often played games together. However, this guy still couldn't replace Manwha. So one day, while out for a walk, Jaemin wondered what Manwha was doing right now. Was he busy? Just then, Manwha, who was very drunk, sprang up with wolf ears and ran up to Jaemin, plopping his head on Jaemin's shoulder. The first thing that concerned Jaemin was where the guy had gotten those ears in the first place, and only secondarily, how he'd ended up in that spot at all. Jaemin was very surprised by Manwha's ears. He wondered if Manwha might be a werewolf. However, he just couldn't bring himself to believe that theory. Suddenly shouting, "Hey Manwha!" A guy ran up to the group. He stopped to catch his breath and asked Manwha why he'd suddenly taken off running. The blonde girl asked, "Jaemin, what are you doing here so late? Do you live here?" The guy smiled and explained that he just worked nearby. The group then asked Jaemin to hand Manwha over to them, since he'd had way too much to drink and needed to be looked after. However, Jaemin says it's no big deal and asks them to let him take care of Manwha himself, since he can take good care of the guy just fine. The guys awkwardly thank him and agree to his request. Now that the guys are alone, Jaemin runs his hand over Manwha's cheek. He asks the guy to wake up and tell him his address so he can drive him home. But Manwha just keeps sleeping. In his sleep, he murmured the words, "I'll call," in a quiet voice. Then Jaemin decides he has no choice but to take the guy's phone and check his contacts to call someone who is very dear to him and knows his address. Jaemin really hoped the phone wasn't locked, and his hopes came true, which made him very happy. He saw Nakyeong's phone number, but decided it would be a bit late to call her now, so he kept looking for the right contacts. He managed to find Manwha's sister's contact information and call her. After a while, Jaemin arrived at the address his sister had given him over the phone. The only problem was that the girl was very angry at her brother's behavior. She ran up to Manwha and started punching him in a fit of rage, asking him if he even knew what time it was. It was already late. As soon as she noticed her brother's wolf ears, she was completely speechless. She was so shocked and angry at the same time that she began to swing her fists at Manwha. Soon she had a moment of clarity and was about to make excuses. However, Jaemin stopped her and said that he already knew everything. Manwha's sister was very shocked. She could barely squeeze out the short word, "Really?" Then Jaemin handed Manwha back to the girl and walked over to the door. He began to open it with a creak, saying, "Well, I'll be going then." Manwha's sister suggested that the guy just stay at their place to sleep, since the taxi had most likely already left. Jaemin then asked her if he would be in the way, and she replied that he wouldn't be, and invited him inside. Some time passed, and Jaemin was already settled into a cozy bed. He looked up at the ceiling and wondered how on earth this had happened, that he was now at Manwha's house and they were sleeping in the same room. Then he glanced over at Manwha and saw the red-haired guy sleeping soundly in his bed, recovering from his drunkenness. But very soon, the guy was tossing and turning so much in his bed that he ended up on the bed next to Jaemin, even though he was still sleeping very soundly, which struck the brunette as quite surprising. He noticed the guy's fluffy red ears again. Jaemin reached out and began stroking them, thinking they looked just like real ears. This caused Manwha to open his eyes wide and wake up, seeing Jaemin lying next to him and stroking his ears the way people do with dogs. Jaemin then awkwardly apologized for waking Manwha, while Manwha continued to silently watch the guy. Their gazes were locked on each other. A moment later, Manwha sat up and leaned toward Jaemin, continuing to look intently into the guy's violet eyes. Jaemin didn't quite understand why Manwha had come so close, but he didn't mind. He simply looked into the guy's eyes, and a warm, romantic silence hung between them. After a few seconds of silence, Manwha broke it with his voice, saying that Jaemin was constantly avoiding him, and that this was causing Manwha great distress. Then Jaemin looked at the guy questioningly, since he didn't understand what he was talking about or what those words about avoiding meant. Manwha quietly admitted that he'd wanted to tell Jaemin something important for a long time, and slowly leaned in closer, hoping for a kiss. Jaemin looked away, embarrassed, but didn't pull away. But things never got as far as a kiss, because a child opened the door with a very loud bang. The girl runs up to Jaemin and stands next to him. She looks at him with adoring eyes and smiles widely. She really wants to play with his toys. Soon, Manwha's sister runs up to the guys, shouting, "Juna!" She apologizes to them, saying that the little girl just can't fall asleep and is acting absolutely awful. She always seems to get a burst of energy as soon as night falls. Then the girl turns to Juna and asks her to go to sleep with her mom, but her daughter absolutely refuses to go to bed right now. Then Juna starts throwing a tantrum and screaming that she doesn't want to sleep with her mom. She wants to sleep with her friend instead. Hearing this, Manwha's sister was even a little taken aback. She said that under no circumstances would Juna sleep with her friend. She had to sleep with her mom. Then Jaemin smiled and said that the girl could sleep in their room too, if her mom didn't mind. They certainly had no objection. The girl was surprised that Jaemin agreed to this, but she decided that since he had agreed and confirmed his choice, Juna could stay there. Jaemin turned to the girl and asked if he should give her a pillow, but she refused, saying that the pillow belonged to Jaemin. In the end, all three settled down to sleep, with Juna hugging Jaemin tightly while Manwha slept next to them. Jaemin noticed how much Juna and Manwha looked alike. This piqued his curiosity, and he decided he needed to find out more about Manwha's family. He reflected on how, after all, it was a good thing that Juna had come. After all, he had almost kissed Manwha. Morning came. Manwha suddenly opened his eyes and jumped out of bed. He looked around, trying to remember what had happened yesterday. He pressed his hand to his face, wondering just how much he'd drunk the night before, and how everything had turned out this way. Very soon he glances at the bed and sees Juna lying next to him, the girl he's used to seeing in this house. He notices that Jaemin is also lying on the bed. This truly terrifies him, since he still has no idea what happened last night or what Jaemin is doing here. The guy screams. It seems to him that this is all just a dream. Since Jaemin is at his house, this simply can't be real. Manwha kept reassuring himself that it was all just a dream, and that he would wake up very soon. Soon he steps out of his room and heads toward his sister. He asks, "What are you doing?" "Cooking." At that very moment she says to him, "Oh, you're finally awake." She smiled and said she'd just started cooking to treat everyone to a delicious meal. The guy mumbled, "Sure," as if he already knew that. The girl asked him in response, "What did you just say?" And the guy replied, "Nothing, nothing." Very soon, Manwha's sister heads for the door and says it's time for her to leave. She invites Manwha to eat with his friend and also asks him to walk Juna to her university. Manwha agrees to everything. When the girl leaves, the guy heads to his room and, opening the door with a creak, shouts, "Hey, Juna, Jamin, time to get up." He walked closer to the guys and urged them to hurry up, since he could see they really didn't want to get up and leave their cozy, warm bed. Jamin rubs his eyes and gradually comes to his senses. He says, "You're just..." Then Manwha smiles and asks, "What?" Jamin says, "Oh yeah, nothing." The guy realizes that Manwha probably doesn't remember anything that happened yesterday, while Manwha himself was beaming with joy. He was urging everyone to wake up quickly. The kids woke up and went to have breakfast. Today, Manwha's sister had prepared a really good breakfast for all of them, quite filling and healthy. Manwha gets Juna dressed for preschool, and as he does so, he feels as if this dream were reality. After a while, the guys took Juna to daycare and handed her over to her teacher. The boy imagines dreams in which he is with Jamin, but he realizes that such dreams are very embarrassing. He also thinks that he'll wake up very soon. Nakin notices the boys. She asks Jamin, "Since when have you been living in this neighborhood?" Then Manwha says, "They're just dreams. He's just as delusional as you are. Very soon you'll..." As he says these words, the guy feels sad, while his friends don't understand him. The girl grabbed the guy by the cheek and shouted, "What are you thinking, huh?" Then the guy shouts even louder that he's in incredible pain. He also asks how such a fragile girl like Nakyeon could have so much physical strength. Nakyeon asked the red-haired guy if he still thought this was all just a dream, and he said he didn't. But he didn't understand why everything was happening this way. Then Jamin interjected. He told the guy that he'd walked him home yesterday, then asked if he remembered that moment. Manwha fell deep in thought and murmured softly, "Home." Manwha remembered that moment, when they almost kissed and he was about to shout out. But Jamin stopped him just in time and covered his mouth with his hand, preventing the guy from revealing the secret of the kiss that never happened. Jamin asked in an even quieter tone, "Have you completely lost your mind, Manwha?" The guy asked the red-haired boy to keep his mouth shut and not say anything unnecessary. Then Manwha nervously swallowed and apologized to his friend for his behavior. At that moment, Nakyeon stood there silently watching the guys. She thought to herself that they had completely forgotten about her. Jamin said, "You're in a relationship, Nakyeon. You..." Both Nakyeon and even Manwha himself were simply shocked by these words. They hadn't expected to hear that at all. Nakyeon pointed at Jamin and asked, "What's wrong with him?" While Manwha himself insisted that Jamin had misunderstood everything. Jamin was very surprised. He decided to ask directly, "Aren't you two dating?" Then Nakyeon and Manwha shouted in unison that they weren't dating at all. Jamin covered his face with his hand, lowered his head, and fell deep in thought, muttering, "Yeah." Manwha remembered that when he had tried to kiss Jamin, Jamin had closed his eyes, and he clearly remembered that threat. It occurred to Manwha that Jamin might actually like him. He just hadn't realized it yet. Jamin blushed slightly. He thought that maybe they could try doing the same things that people in relationships do. Some time passed, and the guys met up at the university. Now Jamin walked up to Ha Manwha and asked him, "Why are you here alone? Where's Nakyeon?" Manwha said she had plans today, so she was catching up on sleep. Now the guys had to sit together alone, without Nakyeon, which made them both feel a little awkward. At one point, Manwha called out Jamin's name, and Jamin in turn called out to Manwha. Then Manwha decided to back down and let the brunette speak first. Jamin said he didn't have a class next, and asked how things were going for Manwha. Manwha blushed deeply, looking Jamin straight in the eyes. Some time passed and the guys left the university. Since neither of them had a class next, Jamin said with a smile that he really didn't want to do all the assignments they'd been given, and then turned to Manwha and asked how much he'd managed to get done. Manwha replied that he hadn't done much, but he should probably get started. The guys stopped, and Manwha asked Jamin which cafe he wanted to go to. The dark-haired guy replied that they could go to a really cool cafe right next to his house. Then Manwha said he was just jealous, and he also casually mentioned that he'd like to stop by Jamin's place, since he'd never been there before. But soon the guy caught himself thinking he shouldn't have said it so bluntly. He started apologizing and said he didn't mean anything bad by it. Jamin says that, whatever the case may be, that cafe is just a hobby for the director. There aren't many people there, so it's quiet and peaceful. Besides, Jamin thinks Manwha will really like the dessert at this place. At these words, Manwha's face lit up with joy. He's simply happy to have such a unique opportunity to go to such a wonderful cafe with Jamin. It's incredibly inspiring and makes him happy. After a while, the guys arrived at their destination. They opened the door to the cafe and were warmly greeted with a smile and the words, "Welcome." Manwha flinched when he saw the guy who had just greeted them at the cafe. Jamin noticed that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was. He just noticed Manwha's strange behavior. Soon he approached the manager and greeted him, and the manager asked him with a smile, "Oh, Jamin, did you come with a different friend today?" The principal asked, "Same as usual today?" and received an affirmative answer, while Manwha stood off to the side, clearly very troubled by something. The guy was completely downcast, but suddenly Jamin turned to him and asked what he'd like to drink, since he was ready to treat him. Upon hearing this question, the guy snapped out of it and looked over at Jamin. Manwha said, "In that case, I'll have a mocha with whipped cream." Jamin also added a cold cheesecake to the order, so the manager wrote down the entire order and asked the guys to take a seat, saying he'd bring everything to their table soon. The guys sat down, and a complete silence fell between them. Jamin looked straight at the guy, trying to figure out what was bothering him. Manwha just looked down sadly. Soon, Jamin asked Manwha if he actually knew the manager, since he was acting a bit strangely. Manwha said that wasn't the case at all. It was something else entirely. But before he could say anything, Jamin cut him off and said that since everything was fine, he'd like to step away to use the restroom. Manwha thought to himself that no matter how you looked at it, Nuna was right. Even though he hadn't met them before, he still shouldn't be rude to them now. Once when he was a child, the boy asked his sister if it was true that there were many others like them, werewolves. He also wondered how to spot them among ordinary people. Nuna replied that he'd understand everything once he saw for himself. Very soon, the manager brought the order and set it on the table. They thanked him, but before leaving, he walked over to Manwha and asked, "You're a werewolf, aren't you?" Manwha clenched his fist tightly, glared at the director, and spat out, "You!" The director smiled and asked the young man to relax. Noticing how angry Manwha was, the director asked him if he had done something wrong. Manwha apologized and said it was just his first time meeting another werewolf, which is why he'd started to get nervous. The principal suddenly decided to ask Manwha about his relationship with Jamin, asking if they were actually dating. Manwha blushed deeply and shouted that wasn't true. Then he asked, "Do we really look like a couple in love?" The principal laughed out loud, thinking Manwha was a very funny guy. But the red-haired boy wasn't in the mood for jokes. He blushed even more, feeling a strong sense of shame. The principal remarked with a smile that since they weren't a couple, it seemed Manwha himself wouldn't mind getting closer to Jamin, and he was clearly enjoying Manwha's embarrassment. Manwha felt uneasy. He couldn't understand why the principal would do something like that. The director laughed even louder, finding each of Manwha's reactions amusing and unique in its own way. Then he pointed to the dessert on the guy's table and asked him to try it, since they were both very tasty. And one of the desserts was his own creation. Then the guy wondered if all the other werewolves were really that strange. It seemed to him that it might even be dangerous for Jamin to come here to some extent. With these thoughts in mind, the guy reached for the dessert with his fork. The guy took a bite, and to his surprise, it was actually really delicious. He thought to himself that even though the director was strange, just as Jamin had said, the dessert really was delicious. Manwha likes the dessert so much that he's practically shaking. He's delighted by the flavor. It's just incredibly delicious. At that moment, Jamin approaches the guys and is surprised that the dessert was brought out so quickly. But then Manwha looks at the principal again and thinks, could this man really have made such a delicious dessert? Manwha wonders whether he should say something right away or wait until later, but his thoughts are interrupted when someone calls his name. Jamin placed his hand on Manwha's and asked if he'd like to come over to his place once they finished their assignments. At this suggestion, both guys blushed deeply and felt embarrassed. Soon after, the boys ate at a cafe and finished their homework. And now, they're both standing by the elevator, heading up a few floors to go to Jamin's place. The whole time, Manwha had been extremely embarrassed. He kept blushing and looking around, glancing at Jamin standing next to him one moment and looking away in embarrassment the next. Manwha wonders if he's the only one who's this nervous, since Jamin seems to be acting quite at ease. Manwha blushed even more and began to wonder if perhaps that conversation hadn't meant anything at all. Manwha realized that even when they were at the cafe, he was the only one who was really nervous, while Jamin had acted quite calm and confident. When the elevator stopped at the right floor and the guys stepped out, Manwha, as he crossed the threshold of the building, tried his best to calm himself down and push away all those thoughts that were making him blush so much. The guy wanted to say something, but Jamin gently pulled him close and kissed him briefly and tenderly. Manwha hadn't expected this at all. A couple of seconds later, Manwha came to his senses and gently pulled away, asking Jamin not to rush things. It had all been too unexpected for him. Jamin asked, slightly embarrassed, if Manwha wouldn't want things to become real between them. Manwha blushed even more and, looking away, mumbled that he'd just come to spend some time together. After that, Jaemin put his arm around the guy and said that, since that was the case, they could go ahead and play video games together. But Manwha pushed him away again, blushing even more intensely from his overwhelming embarrassment. Manwha asks, "So, shall we play one more decisive game?" Jaemin then laughs loudly and says that Manwha is really very cute. The boys start playing, and Manwha feels like he's losing right from the start. But very soon he decides to get his revenge, and now luck is on his side. Manwha gathers his strength, begins to show off all his skills, and this time he wins the game. Jaemin woke up. It was already morning outside. Without even opening his eyes, he let out a sigh. "Well, we stayed up until morning," the guy thought, placing his hand on his forehead. "I wonder how many matches they managed to play yesterday." Yeah, it was a little clumsy at first, but there was so much excitement and fun. The guy rolled from his back onto his side and pressed against something soft. He sensed that something wasn't right and opened his eyes. As soon as he did, he saw a huge wolf right in front of him, taking up most of the bed, with its paws even hanging off the edge. This enormous creature was snoring sweetly, and Jaemin was completely baffled. As soon as it fully sank in and he was fully awake, the boy screamed at the top of his lungs. That scream woke Manwha up, and he jumped out of bed abruptly. Meanwhile, Jaemin wrapped himself in the blanket and stared at the red monster. The wolf, meanwhile, was trying to figure out what had happened and what had woken him up. Jaemin looked at Manwha and couldn't quite believe it was really him. Manwha, in turn, asked the boy if he'd really been that scared of him. He placed his paws on the bed. Leaning closer to Jaemin's face, he said that the boy had seen what he looked like before, after all. Then he apologized, explaining that he hadn't meant to scare him. The wolf began licking the guy's face while he said he couldn't see a thing. He needed to find his glasses somewhere. The boy pushed the wolf's snout away from his face, and the wolf asked where he'd left his glasses. Then he asked if he should look for them, when suddenly there was a crunching sound under the wolf's tail. The guys immediately noticed this and looked down. When they looked at what had been crunching, they found the lost glasses. Manwha turned back into a human and started apologizing. He began asking if Jaemin was kicking him out, where he was going, and that he would fix everything. Jaemin, in turn, tried to calm him down, asking why he was whining. It was his own fault for putting the glasses in the wrong place. He'd just tossed them haphazardly along with the rest of his stuff, that's all. But Manwha wasn't listening and tried to stop him. Jaemin still wanted to throw them away. Manwha guessed that he didn't like those glasses, to which the guy replied that it was something like that. Then Jaemin decided to change the subject and asked if Manwha had anything planned for today, and why was the guy tagging along with him. Manwha replied that he really didn't have anything to do today, and Jaemin wondered who could possibly doubt that. The guys went to a store to pick out new glasses for Jaemin. He tried on a pair of white ones, but they didn't suit him at all. Manwha didn't agree. He didn't understand why Jaemin thought they didn't suit him. Meanwhile, the guy asked to be shown some others. Then they suggested the guy try on a new pair of glasses, and at the same time, Jaemin asked him why he'd been like that morning. Was there some kind of special moon phase or something? And he replied, "Not exactly. The thing is, Manwha had simply lost control, even though he clearly remembered his sister saying that adults aren't supposed to act that way." Manwha smiled and said that maybe he just wasn't mature enough yet and wasn't quite an adult. Jaemin looked at the guy and asked if he'd really lost his composure because of what happened yesterday. Manwha blushed deeply and said he didn't know what had caused it. The guy tried to change the subject and said that those glasses really suited Jaemin. In the end, the guys bought those very glasses. Jaemin breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, his eyes could relax, and now the whole world looked so clear and beautiful. After that, Jaemin turned to the guy and asked him what he'd like to do now. Manwha said that the weather wasn't bad today, so it would be nice to get some fresh air, in every sense of the word. Jaemin said he didn't mind. After that, Jaemin, with a smile on his face, suggested they have lunch and watch a movie. Manwha liked the idea, and now they've gathered together at a cafe for some delicious hot food. Right after they finished eating at the cafe, the guys headed to the movie theater and started watching a movie they'd never seen before. But the movie turned out to be pretty scary, so they weren't exactly thrilled that they'd chosen it. Suddenly, out of fear, Jaemin placed his hand on Manwha's, and Manwha, noticing this, looked at Jaemin's hand. Jaemin started squeezing his hand, while the redhead thought to himself that even though the movie turned out to be scary, it was still a date, right? Did Jaemin feel that too? Memories of that evening flooded Manwha's mind. How he and Jaemin had been playing video games together. How much fun they'd both really had. Things were going well for them, right? For some reason, Manwha began to doubt it. The day started with lectures, and as soon as the professor announced that was all for today, the guys gradually started gathering their things and leaving. Manwha and Jaemin weren't sitting next to each other, and the redhead noticed Jaemin walking with a classmate. Their eyes met, and Jaemin told Manwha to stay in touch, waving his phone in front of him. Manwha smiled happily and waved at the guy, while Nakyong, noticing this, gave the guy a strange look. Manwu's cheeks flushed slightly afterward, but he watched Jaemin walk away with a sweet smile on his face. Nakyun, who had been watching the whole scene, began asking the guy what had just happened. Manwha, not understanding what she meant, asked her to clarify. Then the girl explained to him that she was curious about what was going on between them and asked if Manwha wanted to tell her anything. As she spoke, she started poking him repeatedly with her finger, and Manwha, unable to take it anymore, said he understood everything and would tell her, as long as she stopped poking him. She stopped poking him and said she'd recently heard about a certain cafe, then suggested they go there today. The reviews of the place were all positive. When they arrived at the cafe, they saw a handsome guy sitting at a table there. When he saw Manwha, he noticed him and looked pleased. Manwu's face froze. He'd completely forgotten about him. And Nakyun, seeing the guy's reaction, was surprised that he'd apparently been there before. He should have figured out halfway there what kind of little cafe this was. But on the way, he vaguely recalled something, though nothing specific. Nakyun pounced on the guy with questions about how he used to only go to cafes with her, and yet he hadn't even told her about this place. Meanwhile, Manwu's expression grew increasingly gloomy. Noticing the change in his face, the girl asked why he was frowning so much. That's when the blonde guy recalled what had happened between them. Could it be that as soon as Manwha found out he was a werewolf, he immediately stopped liking this guy's cafe? Manwha frowned and thought that this guy himself must remember what he'd said to him back then. Nakyun, listening to this conversation, was very surprised that these guys were discussing it so freely, to which the blonde-haired guy replied that if someone wasn't in the know, their conversation would just sound like a joke. The girl agreed with that, and then asked the owner what he would recommend for a snack. To which the guy replied that everyone raves about the cheesecake and the Mont Blanc. Nakyun decided to take the guy's advice and ordered what he recommended, along with an Americano and a latte. The guy asked if she wanted everything combined, to which the girl replied yes. Now Nakyun was sitting across from Manwha, resting her hands on the table. She began to look intently into his eyes. She noticed Manwha sighing and asked if he was sure he was okay. Manwha was surprised and asked again, "Me?" Nakyun told him to cut it out and added that he'd made her worry for no good reason. Manwha then said that he was the one feeling bad right now, not her. Nakyun turned her gaze to the principal and asked, "So, are you sure the principal is a werewolf?" Manwha replied, "Probably." Nakyun asked again, since it was important for her to know whether the principal was really a werewolf or if it was just a baseless assumption. She then asked her boyfriend how he found out, and he said his intuition had told him so. The girl raised her hand to her face and said that this wasn't the most reliable method and that she shouldn't put all her faith in it. Then she asked if Manwha thought Jaemin knew about this or not. The guy said he didn't know, and then Nakyun exclaimed that he was simply keeping something to himself. But suddenly, Nakyun realized something that immediately threw her into a state of panic. An atmosphere of gloom began to grow thicker and thicker around her. Manwha wanted to say something, but the girl asked him to hold on and asked again, "Does Jaemin really know that Manwha is a werewolf?" When Nakyun heard the affirmative answer, she asked, "And did he find out that you're a werewolf back on that very day?" And when she received another affirmative answer, she asked, "And he was just pretending not to know that?" And again, Manwha answered in the affirmative. Nakyun asked, "And then you caught his scent and pounced on him?" These words made Manwha feel awkward, and he asked her why she was twisting everything so much, but Nakyun took his words as an attempt to justify himself. Nakyuna asks Manwha to tell her right away if anything happens in his life. She then asks, "Am I really that useless?" Feeling ashamed, he says that's not true at all. Manwha blushed and said he just thought he could handle everything on his own. He then apologized to Nakyun for making her worry about him all the time, though he was still afraid to tell her that he'd been threatened. The girl was angry. She asked, "Seriously? Have you ever even thought about this?" But in the end, Nakyun calmed down, sighed, and said that she was glad after all, that everything had turned out well. Manwha himself began to wonder, is everything really okay? But Nakyun didn't understand what he was talking about and asked the guy if there was really something else she didn't know about. That's when Manwha realized there really was. He pressed his hand to his face. He had no idea how to even begin to explain that he'd spent the entire evening playing games with Jaemin, even before he'd figured out his own feelings for him. In the end, he only told her that he still couldn't bring himself to confess his feelings. Nakyeon admitted that she'd thought it would be something more serious. Minwoo asked if she was disappointed by this, and she replied that she was, just a little. In any case, Nakyeon said, if this is bothering you so much, then I'll help you. She was full of enthusiasm. She believed that the two of them could be together, and that she would be the one to help the two lovers in their relationship. Minwoo was very surprised. He couldn't understand how Nakyeon could possibly help them, so he decided to ask her about it. Then the girl asked him to just wait a little while. Minwoo looked at Nakyeon, who was doing something on her phone, and the whole situation made him feel somewhat uneasy, even though he didn't even understand the reason for those feelings.